Okay, we are about to start, so thank you all for coming. We like to start promptly at 1 o'clock, like the train lines in New York. So thank you all for coming. We are so happy to see so many people here. And so before I introduce the event today, I'm just going to take a second of your time to also tell you about many programs we have coming up, and we have flyers for most of them, not all of them, but most of them at the information table by the front door, and we really hope to see you at all of them. So the next event we have coming up is next week, September 20th, with the author Tom Suarez for his book State of Terror. I'm going to go through just very briefly the list. Then October 6th, we have an unlikely audience with author Will Youmans. October 13th, we have a gallery opening with Through the Checkpoint photography by Katie Archibald Woodward. October 20th, we have the Edward Said Memorial Lecture with David Palumbo Liu. October 26th, we have Balcony on the Moon with author Ibtisam Barakat. November 10th, we have gallery opening Abstractions by Mushid Khair. November 17th, we have our annual conference with many luminaries, and I won't mention them by name because I can't mention all of them. So please, come to our events. So I'm the program manager here. My name is Samira Al-Qasim. I'm very happy to introduce this event, but I do want to thank Dagmar Painter for bringing it to our attention and in fact, I think she should be introducing it, but she didn't want to. But anyway, thank you, Dagmar, and thank you to our speaker, Paul Gordon Chandler, for coming here. So the book he's presenting is called In Search of a Prophet, and we will be selling it afterwards in the boardroom over there. And just very briefly, in this book, Paul Gordon Chandler will take us on a fascinating journey through the all-embracing spirituality of Kahlil Gibran, the early 20th century Lebanese-American poet, artist, and mystic. He is also the author, Kahlil Gibran, of the best-selling book, The Prophet. Chandler explores how Kahlil Gibran, a supreme East-West figure, can be a much-needed guide for our time, related to peace, harmony, and building bridges between the creeds of the Middle East and West. And now just a tiny bit about Paul Gordon Chandler. He's an author, art curator, interfaith advocate, Episcopal priest, and authority on Middle East-West relations, and I believe he's based in Cairo. Am I right? Chicago. Yeah. Still begins with a C. So anyway, thank you. Let's welcome our speaker. Thank you.
I was in Cairo from 2003 to 2013, but now I'm in Chicago. Can you hear me okay? Yes. It's a real privilege to be here with all of you here at the Jerusalem Fund or the Palestine Center. I think you've got two names in some ways. And I want to thank you for coming to hear a little bit about someone who I think is probably one of the most profound individuals that has lived in the last century, and who I think is increasingly, exceedingly relevant, actually, for our times. Someone who was a prophetic voice during his own lifetime, and whose words are even more timely today. Kahlil Gibran, and most people in the West know him for The Prophet, the Arab-American or Lebanese-American in the early 20th century, largely, who became a best-selling author. I grew up in Senegal, West Africa, in a Muslim-majority context. The first 18 years of my life were there, so it's very much home for me. And in Senegal, whenever you need wisdom or counsel, the tradition is to go to an elder. And of course, someone with a life experience, and it's mandatory that they have white hair, so some of you qualify in here. And more often than not, they respond to you in Wolof, which is the local tribal language, Wolof proverbs or parables. And two Wolof proverbs come to mind when I think about this journey that I've been on of looking very deeply into the life of Kahlil Gibran, which resulted actually in writing this book. The first proverb goes like this: Ndank, ma jopo ngolo chi nyai. And it simply means, slowly, slowly, you catch a monkey in the bush. In other words, the most treasured things in life come to you gradually. And I don't really think it's possible to absorb Kahlil Gibran's life and his work quickly. The profundity and the style of it necessitates a contemplative approach when looking at it, where one savors it little by little, shwaya shwaya, as we say in Arabic, relishing them as treasures that they are. So all of this, putting this book together, has been a long, captivating journey for me. The second Wolof proverb is Alau golo kalex ba. All the treasures of a monkey are found in its cheeks, meaning that the deepest riches are usually found under the surface. And there's no question that all of this has been for me a profound excavation, if you will, exploration into the very heart of Kahlil Gibran. Sometimes something written long ago becomes even seemingly more relevant than during its own day, such as what happened to George Orwell's book, 1984, here in the West, not too long ago, or one of my personal favorites, William Dalrymple's marvelous book, which he wrote, I think, almost 2 decades ago now, From the Holy Mountain, which tells the story of Christianity's decline and the land of its origin, the Middle East, over the last 1,400 years. And now more than ever, I think there's a need to hear voices that call us to unity and respect, and to be inspired to live deeply and generously in our thinking and our actions toward the other, whomever the other is. And Kahlil Gibran is just that voice. And his profound insights offer us much needed wisdom and guidance. It's all started for me when I was working on a previous book focused on Christian-Muslim relations. I was looking at and exploring the life and work of a Syrian writer named Mazhar Malouhi, who beautifully bridges the two faiths. And in that context, over and over again, I was struck by how enthusiastically Kahlil Gibran is loved both throughout the Middle East and in much of the West. The East was proud of him, and the West admired him. He was very much this uniting figure. And it intrigued me to look more deeply, not just into his life and work, but also to really his inner journey of development, his spiritual development, if you want to put it that way. And in so doing, I came to discover that Kahlil Gibran really is this supreme East-West figure, and as a result can be an unparalleled guide for us during our times, related to peace, harmony, the building of bridges between the cultures and creeds of the Middle East and West. And his life, approach, and work touches actually on so many of the critical issues of today. Yes, a bridge between East and West and creeds and cultures, but care for the environment, equality for women, interest in spirituality as opposed to religion, immigration, the status of refugees, Syria, and the conflict throughout the Middle East, inclusive embrace of other faiths and learning from the best in each tradition, and the list goes on and on. On the crisis in Syria, during his time, he wrote, "My heart burns for Syria. Fate has been most cruel to her. Her gods are dead, her children left her to seek bread in faraway lands, and yet she is still alive, and that is the most painful thing." Could have been written yesterday. As it was said about Ibn al-Arabi, the 13th century Arab Sufi poet, mystic, and scholar, he is a man for this time, for he has a foot in every camp. And because many excellent biographies have actually been written about Kahlil Gibran, I wanted to delve rather more deeply into his kind of inner spiritual formation, and so I immersed myself in his writings and his environment. More specifically, I sought to understand what led him from being someone who was born actually into what was then an exclusive, sectarian, and intolerant historic Christian community to becoming someone who embraced all in our world and as a result was embraced by all. It took me all over the world, actually, to museums, art galleries, to churches, mosques, and through revolutions, actually, and counter-revolutions. First started over the course of several years visiting all the places he lived, taking Kahlil with me, so to speak, his writings, reading them in the order that he wrote them at each place during each respective phase of his life. It also led me to the far-reaching places of influence his writings and art have traveled. I began in his birthplace village of Bishari, high up in the snowy mountains in Lebanon. And then on to Boston, where he and his family immigrated to Paris, where he did his art training, to New York, where he spent most of his career, ending up in Mexico City, of all places, at the spectacular Museo Sumaya, where the largest collection of Kahlil's writings and art are held in the Western Hemisphere. And in so many places in between, such as Cairo, Egypt, where most of his writings in Arabic in the Middle East were first published, to Savannah, Georgia, at the Telfair Museums that holds the largest or the most extensive collection of his work in the U.S., to the Detroit area, to the Arab-American National Museum, some of you have been there, that focuses on his legacy, and many other places in between, monuments and monuments and schools and parks and streets, including here in D.C., mind you, are named after him. It didn't take me long to realize that I knew a lot less about Kahlil than I imagined. I knew he was Lebanese. I knew he was of Christian background, though I have to admit when I was a younger man, I thought he came from an Islamic background. I knew that he lived in the early 1900s, and I knew that he had written the best-selling book of spiritual prose poetry titled The Prophet. However, what I didn't know was far greater. I didn't know that Kahlil was one of the most widely read poets in history, behind only Shakespeare and Lao Tzu. I didn't know that Elvis Presley was one of his greatest fans and gave away thousands of copies of The Prophet and memorized it completely and was able to recite it at a moment's notice and had ambitious plans to make a film of The Prophet. I didn't know that the singer Johnny Cash was equally captivated by Kahlil's writings and message. I didn't know that he was a friend of the Teddy Roosevelt family. I didn't know that he was sought out by the Irish poet William Butler Yeats to have his portrait drawn by him, and that Yeats's wife liked the portrait so much that she asked him to do one of her as well. I didn't know he knew and drew the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung and the Indian Nobel Prize laureate Rabindranath Tagore. I didn't know he met Auguste Rodin when he was studying in Paris. And while he was in Paris, some of the great Impressionist writers were there at that time. Painters were there at that time. Monet, Renoir, Degas, Mary Cassatt, and the list goes on. Picasso was even around then. And Marc Chagall moved to Paris while Gibran was there. I didn't know that the morning after the Titanic sank, when he had obviously had trouble sleeping, he struggled to know if he should cancel his appointment to draw the portrait of the leader of the Baha'i faith, Abdul Baha. He decided to go ahead with the sitting and was greatly moved by Abdul Baha's calming presence. I didn't know that during the height of the American prohibition on alcohol, Kahlil, with his proclivity to Arak, that strong Levantine anise-flavored alcoholic drink, was able to miraculously secure a continual flowing stash of the contraband. I didn't know that Queen Noor was influenced by Kahlil's work at a young age and was an avid promoter, and is an avid promoter of his writings, as well as the actors Salma Hayek and Liam Neeson. I didn't know that Kahlil was almost excommunicated by his own Maronite Catholic Church as a heretic for his early attacks on the religious hypocrisy that he saw in it, and yet paradoxically at the end of his life, or very end, during his funeral at the Maronite Catholic Cathedral in Beirut, he was honored by the Patriarch and all other church authorities in Lebanon, as well as from leaders of all other faiths, of many other faiths from around the world. I didn't know that Kahlil's writings were instrumental in sparking a reformation and a renaissance of Arabic literature, as he broke with the rigid Arabic literary canons of his day, and actually through his prose poetry developed in some ways a new genre of Arabic literature. I didn't realize that while Kahlil is most known in the West, of course, for The Prophet, in the Arab world, actually, he's most known for his parables and short stories and essays or articles. I didn't realize that actually he was seen as a political revolutionary early on in his career, speaking out through his writings against the injustices of the Ottoman occupation in Lebanon, termed Syria then, calling on his fellow countrymen to rise up to free themselves from the oppressive yoke that they were under. I didn't know that one of the wealthiest men in the world, Carlos Slim, a Mexican of Lebanese heritage, has one of the largest collections of Kahlil's art and writings in Mexico City. I didn't know that one of President John F. Kennedy's most famous quotes was taken from an article Kahlil wrote in Arabic to his countrymen. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask for what you can do for your country. I had no idea of the scope of his influence worldwide, both in terms of his reach geographically and as to the diversity and breadth of the groups that identify with him. I remember being in Timbuktu, Mali, up in the Sahara Desert, in the mud brick home of a Tuareg friend, the nomadic Blue Men, and noticing there in his house with hardly any furniture, a little copy, a French translation of the Prophet. And he seems to be claimed by every group and circle imaginable. Kahlil the poet, Kahlil the novelist, Kahlil the essayist, the activist, the revolutionary, Kahlil the counterculturalist, the philosopher, the artist, the painter, the modernizer of Arab literature, Kahlil the prophet, Kahlil the New Age guru, Kahlil the visionary, Kahlil the humanitarian, Kahlil the Sufi, Kahlil the Christian, Kahlil the universalist, Kahlil the interfaith mentor. He's an enigma, begging the question, will the real Kahlil Gibran please stand up? The renowned contemporary Syrian poet Adonis summed it up perfectly when speaking about Kahlil. He's a star spinning outside of the orbit of that other sun in his universal acceptance. Kahlil's older friend and fellow writer Amin Rehani, whose portrait by Kahlil Gibran is on the cover, actually, of my book, said of him, through Arabic, he conquered our minds, and through English, he conquered our hearts. Kahlil Gibran was born in 1883 into a Maronite Christian family high up in the mountains of Lebanon, a region known as the Kadisha Valley, the Sacred Valley is what that means. It was a place that had sheltered its people during various invasions and resounded with majestic natural beauty. If you've been there, it's spectacular. And all of this had an important, lasting influence on him. In contrast, though, to the gorgeous, peaceful surroundings, Kahlil was born actually into a period of political and interreligious strife, as well as one full of corruption by religious authorities during the latter part of the 1,400-year-long Ottoman occupation. All circumstances that would influence his life and work for years to come. He was a quiet, creative child, and his mother stood out as caring and very much an empowering presence in his life. Sensing early on his unique creative talents and his spiritual sensitivity, she sought to encourage him and at one point secured a book of Leonardo da Vinci's artwork to give him as a gift, which Kahlil remembered as a pivotal moment in his early life. He wrote of the experience, "I will never forget that moment as long as I live. It was as if a ship lost in the fog had suddenly found a compass." His grandfather had been a Maronite priest, and thanks to his mother, he was taught the great biblical stories which captured his imagination at a young age. Showed up again all throughout his writings, all that imagery did, echoing throughout the rest of his life. Kahlil's father was actually not very reliable, prone to drink, with many gambling debts. He was accused of embezzlement while working for the local Ottoman administrator and was sent to prison, and the family lost all their property. His mother eventually decided to follow her relatives to the United States and emigrated with Kahlil's older half-brother and two younger sisters just before he entered his teenage years. And although Kahlil only spent 12 short years in this magical mountainous setting, it was to serve as the foundation of his spirituality and worldview for the rest of his life. Once in the United States, they settled into Boston's South End, and Kahlil began to learn English, and a whole new world of artistic influences began to inspire him. As a young teenager, he met the avant-garde Bostonian photographer and publisher Fred Holland Day, who was equally intrigued by this young Kahlil, and Day introduced him to a vast new world of literature and art and encouraged his artistic ability. Concerned that Kahlil was actually losing his Arab culture and values, his mother sent him back to Lebanon to finish up his high school education under the watchful care of a Maronite Catholic school in Beirut. And the story unfolds from there. When he came back to Boston, within an 18-month period, he lost one of his sisters and his half-brother to tuberculosis, and then his mother to cancer. After a devastating fire that destroyed almost all of his artwork that he had done to date, Kahlil began to write more intensely and became very involved in the world of Arab immigrant writers in Boston, contributing articles and essays to Arab-American newspapers, publishing books at an Arabic language imprint, and helping to organize a group of writers who met regularly to discuss modern Arabic literature. He began to express his feelings through outspoken, some might say scorching, articles in Arabic newspapers in the U.S., books and magazines, and what he learned as an immigrant, he discovered that he had the ability to write in a way that he would not have had he been in the Arab world at that time. And with boldness and without repercussions, he crafted stories and articles addressing highly sensitive subjects. He began to call on the Lebanese people to question ideologies as he himself began to kind of grapple with religion and spirituality and what that meant for him. He spoke out in articles against the oppression by the Ottomans and was concerned by sectarian strife so often fueled by the religious authorities and also with their religious hypocrisy. And then he became very impassioned with women's equality. For the next 10 years, 1903 to 1913, from the age of 20 to 30, Kahlil would seek to kind of balance the push and pull of these two linguistic worlds and artistic worlds as he found himself poised at the confluence of cross-currents between the East and West. Determined to tear down walls of injustice, he eventually found himself threatened with excommunication from authorities in the Maronite Catholic Church of his upbringing. He had compiled a brilliant, and if you haven't read it, and I'll mention some of these books as I go along, brilliant book titled Spirits Rebellious, in which one of his short stories, titled Kahlil the Heretic, blasts the hypocrisy of religious corruption and oppression of the weak and vulnerable in Lebanon. Not surprisingly, not too long after this, while in Paris, representatives of the Patriarch, while they were visiting France, wanted to see him and try to put him in line. He related the encounter quite lightheartedly to a friend who recorded it in her journal. She wrote of the experience. One bishop had a sense of humor, the other none. Non-humorists took him aside. You have made a grave mistake and are making a grave mistake. Your gifts you are using against your people, against your country, against your church. The Holy Patriarch realizes this. And now seek out every copy of the book, destroy them all, and let me take word back from you to Syria and the church and to the Holy Patriarch. Well, as you can imagine, this exchange only spurred Kahlil on further. He actually early on saw himself somewhat as a revolutionary and a rebel. He wrote, "Life without rebellion is like the seasons without spring." He was an advocate for freedom within and without. Kahlil wrote to a cousin in Brazil, "The people in Syria are calling me a heretic, and the intelligentsia in Egypt vilifies me, saying, he's an enemy of just laws, of family ties, and of old traditions. Those writers are telling the truth, because I do not love man-made laws, and I abhor the traditions that our ancestors left us. This hatred is the fruit of my love for the sacred and spiritual kindness, which should be the source of every law upon the earth. For kindness is the shadow of God in man." Through his Arabic novella titled Broken Wings, he became an advocate for women, ahead of his time. Kahlil held an incredibly high view of women, whether friend or stranger or lover or sister or mother, and he consistently fused this admiration for them into his writings and his painting. This is especially noteworthy considering the patriarchal society, of course, that he was from, and also the time period here in America in which he was immersed as women were in the thick of the fight for the right to vote. Even his view of God echoed these convictions of gender equality, and he pushed the boundaries of the accepted norm at that time. Most religions, he wrote, speak of God in the masculine gender. To me, God is as much mother as God is father. God is the father and mother in one. However, albeit an activist early on, as he continually wrote about this growing into our greater selves, and you'll hear that throughout, he matured into someone with a graciousness towards all and an all-embracing spirituality that reached across the divides of humanity, building bridges of peace. And he went from an activist to being, in many ways, being an artistic contemplative, using his many creative gifts to communicate his insights. And regarding his art and writing, one supported the other. When asked which he preferred, he refused to separate them, responding with the impossibility of choosing a favorite child. And at a very crucial time in his life, his lifelong friend and patron, Mary Haskell, appeared in a supportive way to help him, set him on a course that would allow him to pursue and cultivate his many gifts. She eventually funded 2 years of art education for him in Paris to allow him to master the fundamentals. And from that experience, he was able to discover and cultivate his own very unique style that the world now knows him for. After his time in Paris, he moved to New York City, and he continued to publish works in Arabic, and exhibited his artwork at a few very significant galleries. And then in 1918, he wrote and published his first book in English, titled The Madman, which was quickly followed by a second book in English titled The Forerunner. And then in 1923, his third book in English, The Prophet, this is what it looked like when it came out then, gained worldwide attention very quickly because Kahlil's message of universality and respect was actually reaching wider audiences. He also worked on his longest English book, which many people don't know of this book, Jesus the Son of Man, for much of his life, seeking to return the Jesus that he felt had been disfigured in the West back to his Middle Eastern origin, publishing this creative masterwork, is what I would call it, just 3 years before he died at the age of 48. The more I studied, actually, of Kahlil's fascinating life, the more intrigued I naturally became with his inward journey. More than anything else, it was evident that his life was lived toward this deeper dimension, if you will, and he wove this passionate intent into the core of his writings and art. He was a natural mystic who simply was about building bridges and tearing down walls. Always highlighting the importance of the spiritual side of life, he at the same time advocated of finding practical and very honorable solutions to the major challenges that face our world today. His voice is timeless, appealing to heart and mind and reason and faith and reason. He's a guiding spirit in a time when stereotypes, as we also know, and misunderstandings are increasing ever-widening divides. He so powerfully wrote this: I believe in the book, capital B, that makes us all brothers and sisters equal before the sun. I believe in the teachings that set you and me free from bondage and place us unfettered upon the earth, the stepping place of the feet of God. Certainly heeding his wisdom would go a long way today in healing our world. And in this respect, I think it seems to me there are two overarching themes to Kahlil's life and work. And the best analogy I know is one that he used all the time, that of a river, but of a river that actually runs very deep and is very wide. As Kahlil plumbed the depths of his inner life, he went to the core of human existence. Kahlil was forever exploring life's deepest questions. On the purpose of being, he writes, spiritual awakening is the most essential thing in life, and it's the sole purpose of being. He who does not befriend his soul is an enemy of humanity. Life emerges from within. He described himself as going into the silence, intentionally so. He wrote, only when you drink from the river of silence will you indeed sing. He even named his New York studio the Hermitage, decorating it sparsely in a manner that created a contemplative atmosphere for him. Simple wooden bed, several crucifixes made of wood and metal, a small brass chalice, an easel, a tapestry of a Middle Eastern Jesus hung on the wall, and an altar above an altar-like table with brass candlesticks. I love Kahlil's short story of The Tempest. Some of you have maybe read it. It's infused with imagery of the Hermitage that actually was in his childhood village. Now it's the place, actually, where he's buried. The story tells of a young man who's roaming the cedar forest in the mountains of one afternoon, and he gets caught in a terrible rainstorm. and he seeks cover in an isolated shelter inhabited by a hermit, Yusuf el-Fakri. He has heard of Yusuf from local villagers, and he's longed to meet him one day to learn his spiritual secrets. And so the storm here provides him the perfect excuse. And when the young man is welcomed into the hermit's little shelter, he notices that the old man is busy tending to a bird with broken wings. Symbolism abounds. The old hermit, Yusuf, engages in conversation and slowly imparts his wisdom through all this beautiful imagery. And he shares that he left the world to live in the awakeness of life and to think about the compelling and beautiful mystery of existence. I came to this far corner of God's domain, he said, for I hungered to learn the secrets of the universe and approach close to the throne of God. As the climax of the story is reached, the hermit leaves the young man actually sheltered there in the hermitage and walks out into the storm in the height of it and says, I'm going now to walk through the night with the tempest. It's a practice I enjoy greatly. I hope you will teach yourself to love the tempest. Kahlil consistently succeeded at crafting these poetic invitations to journey toward the depths of oneself, exploring that rich reservoir within. In another reflection, he notes, God has placed in each soul an apostle to lead us upon the illumined path. And yet many seek life from without, unaware that it's within them. When someone asked him, what's a mystic? Kahlil is said to have smiled and replied, nothing very secret nor formidable, just someone who has drawn aside one more veil. Kahlil was constantly listening, paying attention to life, and ever in search of greater interior depth. The soul is mightier than space, he wrote, stronger than time, deeper than the sea, higher than the stars. He was preoccupied during his entire life with the depths that he knew the spirit of humanity was able actually to plumb, and the heights that he was convinced humanity was destined to scale. He was an optimist, always striving toward a deeper dimension. He spoke of this in his painting, the whole process he would use in his painting when he was writing his friend Mary Haskell. When I paint a picture, I try to give the picture a presence. It's the coming together of certain elements in a certain way as if they made a sort of path along which God can come through to our consciousness. Another time he wrote to her, I've obtained a first-rate telescope, and I spend an hour or two every evening staring into infinity, close to that which is distant and remote, and in awe of the greater whole. The collection of imagery and created synonyms Kahlil used for God are many. The infinite, the almighty, creator, nature, love, eternal wisdom, unseen, eternal altar, all-powerful, supreme infinite, Lord of life, of love, and of death, great spirit, great intelligent being, great power, the unknown, the great sea, the absolute, and the list goes on. Of Kahlil's belief in God, his contemporary Lebanese biographer Alexander Najjar writes, what kind of God did Gibran believe in? His view of God was not mainstream. Gibran's mysticism is a convergence of several different influences: Christianity, Islam, Sufism, Theosophy, and Jungian psychology. He rejected fanaticism. It was a message of coexistence, and he rejected religious segregation of any kind and called his own convictions from a synthesis of different religious messages without their dogmatism. And over again, Kahlil focused his work on love for God rather than religion. When asked, what is religion, he responded, what is it? I know only life. Life means the field, the vineyard, and the loom. The church is within you. You yourself are your priest. And during a time of deep despair and questioning, he wrote, but somehow when I feel like a little helpless fish in a muddy lake, I cannot help but say to myself, the air which is above the water is not muddy. I cannot lose my faith in the God element. In a time when it actually becomes harder and harder to listen to our inner selves, or our souls, however you may want to term it, or even what we may need spiritually, Kahlil exemplifies someone who journeyed intentionally inward, creating room for silence and to listen to the quiet nudgings of his soul, and intent on allowing both the high and low moments of life to weave together into one voice. And it's that voice within a voice that Kahlil wanted his readers to hear when reading his writings. As his good friend, the eminent American architect and writer Claude Bragdon said, his power came from some great reservoir of spiritual life, else it could not have been so universal and so potent. But the majesty and the beauty of the language with which it is clothed were all his own. This depth, I think, is what led the actor Salma Hayek to produce a film on Kahlil Gibran's book, The Prophet. One of my most enjoyable trips, actually, working on this book was going to the Toronto International Film Festival and to the premiere of the animated adaptation of The Prophet, this feature film, and some of you have seen it, inspired and produced by the actor Salma Hayek and written and directed by Roger Ayers, who, of course, is known for The Lion King. The film was a visual extravaganza with animated chapters from award-winning animation directors from around the world and beautiful music from world-class musicians and singers and composers from Yo-Yo Ma to Gabriel Yared. It was a deeply moving experience watching the film. In fact, it was the only time, with the exception of the film Gandhi, at least my experience, that I've observed such reverent silence in a cinema when the film ended. No one in this diverse audience from all over the world moved or said a thing. At the after party, I had the opportunity of talking with Salma about her inspiration in producing the film, and with her contagious exuberance, she shared her own connection to the Prophet through her grandfather, her Lebanese grandfather, whom she adored. As she remembered as a child, he always had a copy of the Prophet by his bedside table, on his bedside table. And as a young adult, she read the Prophet herself, was deeply moved, and she told us, I found out that there are millions of people around the world who have shared the same kind of connection to this book, in which the words of Kahlil have so strongly impacted them positively and spiritually. And when you read this book, something really strange happens inside you. Your soul recognizes it as truth. And she went on to tell us that's why she made the film. I thought it was crucial that we pay further tribute to a man who was an Arab, who wrote a book of spiritual philosophy that unites all religions and all countries and all creeds from many different generations. And in those words, I believe Salma really captured the essence, actually, of Kahlil's inner journey. For the deeper he went, the wider, interestingly, his embrace became. The depth of Kahlil's spiritual journey led to this extraordinary breadth of spirit in which he experienced actually the oneness of humanity. The reservoirs that he cultivated in the deep gave him the capacity to go wide. Arising from his internalized bridging of these Eastern and Western influences in his life, a faith emerged over time that transcended all cultures and religions. Addressing his fellow Arabs in the Middle East, Kahlil wrote, humans are divided into different clans and tribes and belong to countries and towns, but I find myself a stranger to all communities and belong to no settlement. The universe is my country, and the human family is my tribe. Thou art my brother and sister because you are human, and we both are sons of one Holy Spirit. We are equal and made of the same earth. He went beyond religion to the core of universal spirituality. Historically, both in the Middle East and West, individuals made distinctions between Christian civilization and West and Muslim civilization. He only saw one civilization. And certainly when such divisions are highlighted, it's often for destructive purposes, as an ideology to serve someone else's agenda. And Kahlil's beliefs cut through the divides, reaching across to the other. As he said so powerfully, your neighbor is your other self dwelling behind a wall. In understanding, all walls will fall down. Kahlil recognized the necessity of boundaries and nations, and yet he strove toward what you might call a borderless citizenship that transcended geography. I love the way he expressed his collective embrace of humanity with this poetic visual imagery of a cloud. He wrote, Should you sit upon a cloud, you would not see the boundary line between one country and another, nor the boundary stone between a farm and a farm. It's a pity you cannot sit upon a cloud. Just before the onset of World War I, he wrote an essay titled An Open Letter from a Christian Poet to Muslims. And in it, he refers to himself as a Christian who placed Jesus in one half of his heart and Muhammad in the other. Kahlil's ever-embracing spirituality continued to mature and was expressed thoughtfully in his collection of aphorisms in English titled Sand and Foam. He wrote, "Should you really open your eyes and see, you would behold your image in all images. And should you open your ears and listen, you would hear your voice in all voices." Words that continue to echo and inspire. And touching on the most sensitive subject of all in the Middle East, religion, he does so by looking at the nature of God. "You are my brother and sister, and I love you. I love you worshiping in your church, kneeling in your temple, and praying in your mosque. You and I are children of one religion, for the varied paths of religion are but the fingers of the loving hand of the Supreme Being, extended to all, offering completeness of spirit to all, and anxious to receive all." Finding a way to powerfully communicate a non-sectarian version of spirituality was something that weighed very heavily on Kahlil. And consequently, he felt that all of the events of his life seemed to lead him toward the creation of his most well-known book, The Prophet. "It's the biggest challenge of my life," he wrote. "My entire being is in the Prophet. Everything I've ever done before was only a prelude to this." And he felt a sense of sacred responsibility in writing it as if it was almost a holy book. And echoing or embodying the East and the West, it actually speaks to people from all religions. It prompted his friend, Mary Haskell, to remark upon first receiving a copy of it, "It's the most loving book ever written." Kahlil summed up the book's theme in a letter to a friend by highlighting our inherent connection to each other and to creation by simply saying, the whole prophet is just saying one thing: we are far greater than we know, and all is well. Although Kahlil often spoke directly of God, his writings and his art were infused actually with a deeper concern, that of living in harmony with one another and all creation. He wrote, "I bid you to speak not so freely of God, who is your all, but speak rather to and understand one another, neighbor unto neighbor. Understanding and empathy emanated from his person, ideals so necessary in our contemporary context. Also to Kahlil, while spirituality served as an attempt to connect with the divine, he realized that it could not be found in creeds or dogma, and that to search for God solely in a mosque or a church or a temple was actually to limit one's search for wholeness. So his quest became an opportunity to unearth that which was woven in the very fabric of nature, in other words, the environment. And in an age in which issues in our environment are at the forefront, with deep respect for the earth, Kahlil's holistic worldview rings forth. He did not separate the spiritual and the natural. He saw them in harmony. Just after Easter in 1931, after a battle with ill health, Kahlil lay dying. He was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City, the same hospital that received survivors from the Titanic, and then again, survivors from 9/11. At age 48, with cirrhosis of the liver and tuberculosis in one lung, he slipped from this world into the next realm that he believed would be an endless dawn, forever the first day. The breadth of diversity and the outpouring of appreciation for his life says it all, reaching across all the religious and cultural divides. In New York, it was a rabbi, actually, who organized this special tribute to Gibran. It was a mosaic of diversity there, with faith leaders praising his life: Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Baha'i, Theosophist. As requested in his will, his body was returned to Lebanon. When the body arrived by ship in Beirut, the coffin was opened, and he was posthumously awarded the Decoration of Fine Arts Medallion by the Ministry of Education for his life's work. And then, led by governmental dictators, That could be. Governmental dignitaries, French, checking to see if you're awake, French military officers, diplomats from all over the world, and then leaders from Christian, Muslim, Druze, and Jewish communities, along with thousands of school children. The entourage processed past my admirers who lined the streets, up to the Maronite Catholic Cathedral, where the blessing was done from the Archbishop. Once thought of as a rebel, he is received with wide open arms as a celebrated native son. In the tribute to Kahlil that was held just the day after at Beirut's Grand Theater, the president of Lebanon, renowned writers and poets, representatives from the Islamic, Christian, and Druze communities, all reflected on Kahlil's spirituality and universal appeal. He was a Sufi sage for all humanity, said one of the speakers. And then the procession made the 50-mile journey on foot from Beirut all the way up to the village of Bishari, all the way lined with townspeople. They stopped 20 times for local ceremonies. And then he was eventually laid to rest, and as had been requested, in that hermitage grotto of his childhood, high up in the mountains of his beloved cedar trees, which is now actually part of the Gibran Museum. And more than ever, his words ring true. For in one soul are contained the hopes and feelings of all mankind. One of my favorite allegories by Kahlil is titled The River. It's very appropriate to mention here at the end because it's frequently said at funerals and memorials. Somewhat reminiscent of Longfellow's poem Hiawatha, and it's set in the beloved Kadisha Valley, the sacred valley, and it visually highlights Gibran's life journey, one mixed with both joy and suffering, but which led him to that deeper realm. The river. In the valley where the mighty river flows, two little streams met and spoke to one another. One stream said, "How came you, my friend, and how was your path?" And the other answered, "My path was most encumbered. The wheel of the mill was broken, and the master farmer who used to conduct me from the channel to his plants is dead. I struggled down, oozing with the waste of those who do not but sit and bake their laziness in the sun. But how is your path, my brother?" And the other stream answered, "Mine was a different path. I came down the hills among fragrant flowers and shy willows. Men and women drank with me with silvery cups, and little children paddled their rosy feet at my edges. And there was laughter all about me, and there were sweet songs. What a pity that your path was not so happy." At that moment, the river spoke with a loud voice and said, come in, we are going to the sea. Come in, speak no more. Be with me now. We are going to the sea. Come in, for in me you shall forget all your wandering, sad or joyful. Come in, and you and I will forget all our ways when we reach the heart of our mother, the sea. Kahlil's life journey and breath can't help but challenge us all. It reminds us that it's time to reach across divides that surround and break down walls of inequality and justice. It's time to build bridges in whatever ways we can conceive, including peaceful resolutions. It's time to defend the vulnerable and the oppressed. It's time to unite and see our own reflections in the faces of others. It's time to find a way to carve out room for quiet and respect for the environment. It's time to delve deeper in our own faith traditions, past all the outward imperfections and trappings, to the core of life. In one final vignette from Kahlil, his words inspire and challenge us to our greater selves to do something. It's titled, Set a sheet of snow white paper. Set a sheet of snow white paper, pure was I created, and pure will I remain forever. I would rather be burnt and turned to white ashes than suffer darkness to touch me or the unclean to come near me. The ink bottle heard what the paper was saying, and it laughed in its dark heart, but it never dared approach her. And the multicolored pencils heard her also, and they too never came near her. And the snow white sheet of paper did remain pure and chaste forever, pure and chaste, and empty. I close with the moving words of Kahlil's good friend Mikhail Naimi, who wrote the first biography on him 3 years after he died. For some purpose unknown to you and to me, Gibran was born in Lebanon at the time he was born. And for a reason hidden from you and me, Arabic was his mother tongue. It would seem that the all-seeing eye perceived our spiritual drought and sent us this rain-bearing cloud to drizzle some relief to our parching souls. Thank you. It's warm up here. Yes.
I just had a question. Obviously, we understand everybody's personal relationships. Did he make close friendships? Did he have loves? I mean, what sort? Thank you.
Yeah.
Shall I repeat it now, or I could?
No, I can mention it. Yeah.
Thank you.
She's just talking about his personal relationships, his loves, his friends, etc. He was one of deep friendship, and consequently, you'll find after he left the level of loyalty that those friends had to him, in many ways carrying on his legacy for him. There's a sense in which we would forget about him if it had not been for those intimate friends. In terms of women, obviously Gibran would not be Gibran without Mary Haskell, who was his patron, not his lover. They loved each other. He had others over the course of his life, from what we know. But Mary and Gibran had this kind of soul love, almost one connection. And but she was his guide in the English language. She had that spiritual parallel heart that he had. It's almost like they were made for each other. And she wouldn't be who she was and vice versa had they not. But they were not married, and at the end of the last good chunk of their life, they were separated. She was in Savannah, Georgia, and he was in New York. Sure.
Anybody else have a question?
Yes. Oh.
Could you maybe talk about, he's obviously a man of incredible intellectual and spiritual profundity. That just seems to be a really glaring contradiction to his alcoholism. I understand the man drank himself to death. Can you reconcile that? Or maybe there's no contradiction? I don't know. What's your take on that?
Well, you know, Blake's got that line, life was made with joy and woe. And when we rightly know this, through the world we safely go, or something like that. Yes, I wouldn't say it was a conflict. I would say it was ended up being one of his struggles. It was one of the ways I think he handled some of the stresses that he had in his life. So now, the flip side is if you like Arak, okay, you might understand it. But but that obviously, I think the beauty of Gibran is he wasn't a saint. He wasn't a saint. He would never want to call himself a saint. Okay? But in the midst of his humanity, his humanness, he dug deep. And he finds himself continually realigning himself to keeping himself on that path of the spiritual. He's not an orthodox small O figure, obviously, on any religious front, you know. One of the reasons I wrote this book is that his worldview, this all-embracing worldview of tolerance and of inclusivity, etc., is very, very reflects a lot of the younger generation in many ways and where they're at. They just don't know about him. So in a sense, I was trying to reintroduce him to another generation. But it is sad. He died from a few things, but one of them was cirrhosis of the liver, which most feel was caused by that. Yeah. Yes.
Just wondered, you mentioned that a number of his paintings or drawings or maybe scores were burned or destroyed at one point. Were there any descriptions of what subject they focused on, or what medium, etc.?
Yeah, at that phase they were large. This is early on. So he was, I think I can't remember exactly, but he was maybe 18 or something when they burned. you know, maybe even a little younger. So, but that's what prompted him, it seems like, to focus a little bit more on the writing side, okay? It was almost a way to cope with that news. All the paintings we have now, of course, were done after that period. But it was they were largely somewhat ethereal then, so he was gravitating toward that, which eventually, that's why he identified in many ways with the symbolist movement, and then portraits as well at that time. Figurative, but this is before his art training as well. Yes.
Could we just use the microphone because we are live streaming this? Thank you.
I've just always been curious about sort of race and looks and how, I mean, Boston at that time is pretty white. The group of people he was with were all white, upper class. There wasn't a lot of sort of lightly brown skin even, or dark hair, or how did he navigate that? And how, I think that there was a lot of interest at that time in sort of the foreign or the other, you know, and so a lot of Indian influences were coming into the sort of bohemian elite. But if you had any insights or if you'd learned anything about kind of how that played out.
Well, he lived two worlds in Boston early on. One was in the South End, where a lot of the Syrian immigrants, or Lebanese immigrants as well, lived at that time. Now, if you go there now, it's still immigrants, but Chinese mostly. And I go in my book, I talk a little bit about that. So that's home. That was his kind of, you know, the heart of where he embodied his life. But then through these few contacts, Fred Holland Day, through Mary Haskell, through some other women, in a sense, they were bridges for him to the larger community. And largely an established community, interestingly, that had the time to be interested in the arts, not the working class. And that's how he, for example, was introduced to Teddy Roosevelt's family. Corrine Roosevelt, his sister, was a big admirer. Part of their interest, not those few bridge individuals, but part of the interest of that other side, that when he got over there, was the exotic. Here was this spiritual, unique, young Arab, you know. So that was very trendy at that time, if you want to put it that way.
You have a question over here.
Thank you. Thank you for a great presentation. As a mother of two that were born here, I've been trying to kind of shove down their throat Kahlil Gibran, and it hasn't worked. What advice do you have for us parents who really want to introduce it to American, who are Arab Americans that are born here at an age which I feel they really should have this as part of their reading material, as their education, to bring them a little bit closer to the religion and understand interfaith dialogue. I'm having a very hard time bringing that to the kids. Any advice?
Well, first of all, as you know, as we all know, our children don't love it when we... So that's one thing. But in time, everything comes with time, you know, and of course, we all develop at different phases. So I would say timing is everything, okay? And then, of course, there are different entries into how one can look at Gibran. I find, I'm a big fan of Tolstoy, but actually the biggest, the literature of Tolstoy that I enjoy the most are what he wrote in the last kind of phase of his life, which were short stories for the commoner, okay, and the peasants at that time. And Gibran wrote a lot of very beautiful short stories, which are not taxing to read. They're not so mystical like the prophet. You know, you've got to be in a certain disposition, of course, and a certain phase of life to really digest this and to understand it. I mean, you can actually, many of you have probably read it, but if you read it again with an open heart, it will be like fresh to you, you know. So I would start that way in some ways with some of those.
Thank you.
Here you go.
Her question leads into mine. I was wondering, and I was going to ask you afterwards, if you have a 16-year-old who is very much into political and social and peace issues, and very secular. Maybe I shouldn't be asking you this question. I was wondering if I should be giving him a copy of The Prophet, or a copy of your book, or a copy of some other book. that you would recommend?
Well, always my book, you know. But
I figured that.
I mean, let's be honest. But
no, he's not a major reader, but he's a major thinker and very in depth.
No, actually, for that, I would actually, if he's interested in political events and issues and things
yes,
like that,
yes, very
I would
much so.
encourage him to read Gibran's essays and articles that he wrote to the Arab community. Okay, to the Middle Eastern audience.
Is there a specific
but
book
in
that
Arabic,
I could get?
But they're all translated now.
Is there a specific book?
There are. Yes, I can let you know afterwards where to look them up. They're not widely read in the U.S., but they're.
Well, that I don't think that matters. I think that would
because
be
they really talk about some interesting things, how to resist occupation and women's equality in the Middle East. I mean, social issues, etc. You know, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions?
By the way, I can speak easily for another hour or two on Gibran.
I, too, want to just thank you for an outstanding presentation. And I remember reading The Prophet when I was in college. And that's why I got so excited when I heard about your book and invited my daughter today. And I had a similar question to the last two. For young people, would you recommend that they read The Prophet first or your book? But I think you've answered that the articles and the essays that he has written would most appeal to young people today that are concerned about lack of tolerance, lack of basic human rights, lack of environmental support for climate change, that would be most appealing to them, and then it would be helpful if you could tell us where we could find those. Thank you.
Okay. One thing I would say about my book, I try to write it popularly, so it's hopefully not hard to digest. Not academically, because I wanted this to be accessible for people. And it also, for the younger generation, I would say is, I don't know, for example, your own family's religious heritage, but if there's any kind of Christian heritage in the past, it allows people, when you look at how he deals with it, wow, there's some interesting things about even this Jesus figure, even though I may reject the Christian faith, and I don't like all that I see in religion right now, which is, of course, can be very true, especially at this moment in our country. And so for the younger generation, he really hits on all these worldview points. But maybe have a friend give it to them as opposed to a parent, you know. One more question? How about that? Oh, there are two. Okay, two more questions. And yeah.
Two more.
Two more is okay.
Yeah, you mentioned that he's a Sufi. Were he influenced by any
yes.
Sufi scholars back then?
Yes, very much so.
Is he similar to any maybe Arab Sufi writers?
Yeah. I
right
mean,
now?
I think, of course, technically he's not a Sufi because he's not Muslim, but he was like a Sufi. And he was very influenced by individuals like Hallaj and Zahrawardi and Ibn al-Arabi, Shwaya Rumi a little bit, and Al-Ghazali even. He actually read a good bit of Al-Ghazali. So he was, I mean, if you go to his library, you see all the books that he owned, and you flip through them, as they usually, if you have permission to open up and you'll see they were highly used. So he was quite a reader. And so yes, he was very influenced by Sufi thought. I mean, a Sufi, what is a Sufi? A Sufi is the mystics within Islam. And of course, I grew up in Senegal where it's a mostly Muslim country, 98% Muslim. All of them are Sufis. They're from one of 5 Sufi brotherhoods. Okay? I sat on the plane with one actually coming here from Chicago yesterday. And but that Sufism is totally different than the Sufism from Egypt or let alone Turkey. Okay? But the commonality is this sense of entering into that deeper dimension and union with God, however one terms God. And that's the mystical component. And so he was very influenced by those coming from Christian tradition of mysticism as well, like Julian of Norwich, etc. So
we had one more question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what you think of our Kahlil Gibran Memorial here in Washington on Massachusetts Avenue, and how does it compare with others you've seen?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm thrilled that it's here. I'm heartbroken that nobody knows it's here. And that even if you know, you hear about it and want to find it, it's not necessarily so easy unless you just say across from the British Embassy, you know, kind of thing. Because it's kind of tucked back in there. But it's actually a gold mine to walk around there and read the quotes that are engraved, you know, in the marble. I think the actual sculpture is beautiful, the bronze. And and of course on Copley Square there's a wonderful memorial as well to Gibran. And they're all over the world. There's a beautiful one in Beirut, they're in Brazil, they're in, you know, in Morocco, etc. But I think it was George Bush Sr., President George Bush Sr., who inaugurated that, of all things. It's interesting, isn't it? So, yes. Thank you very much.